Thanks for stopping by to check out this episode of Vintage Audio Review. In this episode, I'm going to talk about this JBL 3107 crossover network. Now, this came from a JBL 4350 loudspeaker, and if you were to go on eBay, and this is February 2023, you can buy a pair of these speakers for $143.5 thousand. So there is a story as to how I got this, and what happened was my buddy Ian and I were invited to our buddy Richard's home for a party, and Richard has a pair of 4350s in his converted garage. It was powered by a Macintosh preamplifier, which I am not sure the model number right now, as well as 4 Macintosh MC30 monoblock tube amplifiers. I'm not sure how things were connected, but it looked kind of like a mess once we got into it. I digress. We were listening to the 4350s, and the speaker on the right just didn't sound quite right. The treble was really lacking. Not knowing what kind of configuration Richard had this thing hooked up with, Ian and I decided an audio intervention was necessary the following week. We came out there, we rehooked things up, we got rid of the MC30s, and we used a Macintosh 8-channel AV amplifier that we bridged as mono amps, so we had 4 channels that we needed. We also used a JBL active crossover designed for use with the 4350 to connect to the power amplifier and then connect the power amplifier outputs to the appropriate bi-amplified ports on each speaker. And when everything was all hooked up, it still did not have the treble that it should out of the right speaker, and that was borne out. As I had brought my measurement gear, I measured both speakers, and indeed the right speaker's treble response was really diminished compared to the left channel's treble response. As we were out of time for that day, I made another trip out to Richard's, and with his help pulled out the 3107 crossover, figuring that maybe there is a dried out capacitor or something. And that is what we are looking at here. I thought it would be nice to actually explain how I measured it and show the process I used to measurement. As far as the result, I wasn't able to find any frequency response plots for this 3107 crossover, so I thought I would measure it myself and model it and show the results and document how I did everything for posterity's sake. I measured each of the resistors, capacitors, and inductors by themselves, and they all checked out very close to their specs on the schematic. I also modeled the crossover network using a program called Tina TI that showed a frequency response that sort of looked like what I measured but wasn't exactly like I measured, and that is often the case between what you actually measure and the model of it. These graphs show the actual frequency responses that I measured for the JBL crossover. You can compare that with the previous slide to see what the calculated values are, and they are in the same ballpark. You would like them to be 100%, but usually you don't get an exact match between the predicted and the measured values. That being said, there is nothing wrong with this crossover. Now, the 4350 speaker and hence this crossover are dated from around 1975. And it's looking like there is a problem with the tweeter horn, and I believe it is a 4305 horn that will be tested separately. Anyway, I kind of wanted to show a close-up of the adapters that I made and give a little bit more of a detailed look of the components for this crossover. Oh, what fun. This is the component side of the JBL 3107 crossover, I guess I would say. We do have 4 30-watt resistors there that are used in the crossover, as well as 4 capacitors here. The input to the crossover is these 2 wires right here, and I'll show the other connections here. We do have connections right in this area for the L-pad, which we'll see a close-up of in just a second. Then we'll look at the inside of the crossover and see what is underneath the board. There's 4 screws in the corners that hold the circuit board down. The connectors on the 4350 are push-on style kind of connectors, and the other side of them inside the speaker, it has different sex spade lugs. So the two wires, the red one and the black one here and here, those guys have spade lugs, opposite sex spade lugs, that connect to the speaker terminal block inside the speaker. In order to connect to the crossover, I had opposite sex connectors here, which I connected to wires which plug into this little adapter here. And this little adapter here makes it so that you can connect an RCA input into wires to connect to whatever form you need to. In order to measure the output of each crossover section, they all needed to be loaded with 8 ohms, which seems to be the most likely impedance for each of the drivers that I could find. And there is a small 8.2 ohm resistor there, and the ends of the resistor go to that RCA to wire adapter, and this red-white wire right here and then the black wire here are for the mid-range part of the crossover network. There's also one for the high frequency and the mid-bass. They all are similarly attached. They all have an 8.2 ohm resistor across them, and that goes into the RCA adapter. This guy right here is the L pad, and it actually is mounted such that the very front of the control sticks out the front of the speaker, and it varies the amount of attenuation for the high frequency part of the crossover, and it mounts back onto the top of the circuit board as I showed earlier. Here is the inside of the 3107 crossover, and I'll see what we can focus on first. This right here is a 20 microfarad 200 volt non-polarized capacitor. So this guy right here is a 1.8 millihenry inductor. So this guy right here is a 0.16 millihenry inductor, and then kind of sneaking in the corner, let's see if we can see it. So this guy right here is another 1.8 millihenry inductor, and you can kind of see all this waxy stuff down here. And here's just another view of one of the inductors and the capacitor right there. You can kind of see where the circuit board fits, and that is the inside of this crossover. What ended up being the problem with the JBL 4350s and their crossovers was that they were wired incorrectly. On some of the pictures you can see some taped wires with numbers on them, and apparently when everything tested fine, I came back and I found out that it was hooked up incorrectly. I don't know what was going where, but things were not correct. Had I the schematic of the crossover with me and followed the wires, I would not have done all the modeling and everything else that I did. But that's what happened, and it was a nice learning experience, and we gained some information out of it. This is one of the JBL 4350s. I'll just talk a little bit about it. We have a tweeter here. Now I will mention that this tweeter on both speakers was mounted horizontally, so it was rotated. You can loosen this up. I'm pretty sure from the pictures we saw that it should be mounted with the slot vertically. We have our two 15-inch woofers here. We have a 10-inch mid-range. We have another horn mid-range here, and then we have the horn tweeter here. Now one thing that's kind of unique, let me come over to the other side. We have these two wooden plates which allow you could take these plates off, and then you could move this guy over to here and this guy over to here and put the plates over there. So they allowed you to set up your room differently. You have ports on each side for the base. They look to be about 3-inch ports. There is a foam covering that originally went over them, but at this stage in life we do not have the original foam covering. This is our tweeter control down here, which you saw in the other video. And I'll just talk about the system that he has. He's got the Macintosh C48 audio preamplifier, of which the Mark Levinson CD player is hooked up to, and then we have a Macintosh MC7108, and that's an 8-channel power amplifier, and we have bi-amped 4 of the channels for each speaker. You need a separate driver for the low frequency and the high frequency. So this, as operating as 4 mono amplifiers, does the job nicely. It used to sit up there. We brought it down, and Richard had this JBL 5235, and I swept it and made sure that it worked, and we set that up so that everything is bi-amped. Originally, when we came here, he had 2 MC30s here, 2 MC30s 20 feet across the room, and a long RCA cable connecting between the preamp and that, and basically it looks like he took the full range preamp out with a Y adapter and split that into both the high and the mid range, so you had no effect of separating the frequencies. And so that's kind of the way this setup is. I listened to it. I think it sounds really good. It does put out a lot of bass. You'll see the measurements in a little bit that I did using the REW software. You can kind of see the frequency response that I measured with this guy about 1 meter out. So that's kind of a quick take of the units. How did they sound? So after all that work, what do I think of the sound of the JBL 4350 speakers? Well, it's a different kind of a sounding speaker than what I'm used to listening to with my Lascalas or the KEF 107s or the Watt 3 Puppy 2 speakers that I have. We listened to several CDs, and it doesn't have the overly crisp high end that those other speakers I mentioned, but this thing has a very wide soundstage. And in particular, when we put on this Eric Clapton Unplugged CD, I was really impressed with the soundstage that was delivered by these, and just kind of the clarity and just kind of the warmth to the sound that these have. They're a speaker that would be good for certain kinds of music, and they sound really nice with maybe some jazz. I didn't have any hard rock to play. This is more kind of a mellow acoustic guitar kind of thing, at least the portions we listened to. But they sound really nice. Like I said, the sound stage was just surprising. Instruments were coming everywhere, and it sounded really nice. They're just a nice speaker. Richard has a bunch of speakers. We'll be seeing more, and it's kind of nice to be able to sit over here and you can listen to the Klipschorns, or you could sit over there and listen to Bozaks, or you can listen to 4350s over here. But the 4350s have a big kind of a warm sound, and it's just kind of been a pleasure to be able to listen to them and get them going and sounding a lot better than what they did. They sound much better now that we have everything connected as good as we were able to connect it up to. So let me give a little quick look around the room. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. This is more of a close-up of the 4350 speakers, just to see them in a little bit more detail. Here's a closer view of the Macintosh gear that's driving the 4350s, as well as the Mark Levinson CD player. And Richard has quite a record collection. There's some Macintosh gear up there in the corner, you can see. And here we have the Wright 4350, and you can see that there is a Macintosh MC 2300 power amplifier on top of it, and a Krull preamp. I don't know the model number of the Krull. And we can see a Bozak speaker next to that, and more records. And of course, if you're familiar with the video, I did a review of the P48, and Richard and I did some swapping, and Richard is now the proud owner of the Siemens P48. There's a homemade tube preamp on the top of it, which will be subject of a review. And the turntable is a VPI something or other. And kind of just going around the room. Oh, I have to show you this. Let me, we have to zoom in on this here. I had to point this out, but we have all this expensive equipment, and there's a power strip here, and you have to use this pool cue to hit the on-off switch to turn everything on and off, just in case you were kind of wondering. And that one funny looking thing with the Obsidian piece on it is a Technics SLP 1200 CD player. It's rather interesting. There's more stuff that I can shake a stick at. There's a bunch of theta gear here, some neat turntables, and of course there are the Klipsch horns in the corner. And more records. And we have a pair of MC30. There was a review done on these MC30s here, and here we have a Reco Cut turntable and more records. So this is Richard, who you've heard me mention along with Ian, who's over off to the side. And I thought Richard would like to explain how he came by the speakers and why he liked the 4350 so much.
Hi, we're in Tucson, Arizona, and I had a guy. He was very low on money, and his dad had passed away, and his dad had a friend who was a hoarder and stored all sorts of stuff on his property. Well, nonetheless, they sold the property and they moved all this stuff to a storage unit. And one day this guy says, listen, I need money immediately. Come get these speakers. So I went over to look at them, and they're the iconic JBL 4350s, the speaker that was in the studio where Queen did Bohemian Rhapsody. They were hung from the ceiling. They're supposed to be not on the ground level, but hung. But the guy said to me he needed money today, and if I gave him $1,200 for them, I could get them today. So the cabinets were very rough, and we ended up doing veneer with them, and the surrounds we redid as well. So these are wonderful, wonderful example of a JBL 4350s in walnut, and Scott has helped me tremendously by using a JBL crossover, and we used a 6-channel eight-channel Macintosh. You can tell that Scott knows much more than I do. But please enjoy them, and we're enjoying doing this, getting some of this stuff filmed. Maybe soon we'll even do a Paragon cabinet.
Yes, it's on the to-do list.
Thank you.
Why don't you say hello too, Ian?
Hey folks, I'm here too. You know me from
Episode 5.
Episode 5.
Yes.
Take care. Enjoy.
Before I show a plot of the frequency response that I measured, I wanted to explain where the microphone was pointing at, and that would be right in the center of this crosshatch. You can kind of see this little laser level that I have here, and it's on top of the calibrated microphone. And it's pointed right here, kind of in the middle of the speaker, I would call it. And I am 1 meter away from the speaker. So this is the frequency response plot showing the sound pressure level versus frequency. And this is for the left speaker. That was the only one I measured today. And so the way that I measured this speaker was that I set up a 1 kilohertz tone, and that would be going to the higher frequency range of the crossover, and I adjusted the amplifier so that I had 2.83 volts at 1 kilohertz, and that was the level that the test was done at. And so it's a very high sound pressure level. You can see here's 100 dB here, which is very loud, and it's really high, and then it starts coming back down again. And at 600 hertz, it's 90 dB SPL, and then kind of goes up, and right here it's at 100 dB SPL, and then it drops back down into the 80s at the very high end of the spectrum there. But that's kind of the frequency response plot that I made. Of course, there's a lot of variations in it because that room is not very anechoic as far as sound waves go, but it kind of just gives you an idea of the sound pressure level at 1 meter with 1 watt. That thing can get rather loud with a little bit of power. What they did. So once again, I thank you for watching this episode of Vintage Audio Review. And if you have any comments, please leave them below. I love seeing your comments and experiences, and if you have not subscribed to the channel, it would be nice if you would do so. And if you like the video, it would be nice if you liked the video as well. And until next time, have a great day or night.